I am so excited to begin this next series of lessons with you because this next series of lessons is going to take us into the period of the Kings, which is one of the most exciting portions of Scripture, especially of the Old Testament Scriptures. You're going to have all sorts of great stories of people who served God, people who did the right thing, people who made hard choices, people who were willing to put on righteousness. What a great period of history, especially compared to what we've been studying previously. If you'll go ahead and open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 1, that's where we'll be beginning in this series of lessons as we dig into the stories of the kings. In order to truly appreciate the lessons of 1 Samuel chapter 1, 2, and 3, you need to understand what led up to this, the previous lessons that we've been talking about. 1 Samuel starts with a different mood than what we've had in previous lessons. Judges tended to leave us in despair. The author of the book of Judges intentionally, I believe, left us with a picture that things were absolutely horrendous in Israel. They didn't start off so bad. Othniel and the early judges, they were pretty good. They were interesting. They served God. They did what God had called them to do. But by the time you get to the story of Samson and the story of the Levites, and the story of the concubine who was chopped into pieces, and that repeated statement in the book of Judges where it made statements, uh, make sure I quote it correctly over Judges chapter, the very last verse. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what seemed right to him. That picture of selfishness, that picture of despondency, that picture of people who did not turn to God, it leaves us with such a horrible feeling about God's people. Well, Ruth left us with a little bit of hope. The story itself wasn't very hopeful. The story of itself was, honestly, if you kind of dig into the characters that you have there, and the characters that Naomi and the difficult things that she did, and how to deal with some of those uh, questionable decisions she made, you still, at least at the end of the book, are left with that picture of hope because of the genealogy. That Ruth and Boaz had Obed, and Obed had Jesse, and Jesse had David. And that points to that king in Israel that Judges said did not exist yet. So the people did the selfish, unrighteous thing. Well, Ruth leaves us with, but the king is coming. The king is coming. And that gives us a great glimmer of hope. Well, First Samuel begins with that feeling of renewal. It's no longer a picture of despair. It's no longer a picture of life without hope. Well, maybe just a glimmer of hope. It begins with renewal. It reminds us that there's a priesthood, because the beginning of the book of First Samuel spends a lot of time talking about Shiloh and the tabernacle, and you've got a what seems to be a faithful priest who is serving there at the tabernacle and doing the right thing. And it reminds us that even as a backdrop to everything going on through the book of Judges, there's still a tabernacle and a priesthood, and there are still faithful Levites serving the Lord. It reminds us that there are still faithful people. While they're not the central characters through the book of Judges, there are some faithful people in Israel, and you see that in the characters here in the early chapters of 1 Samuel. You also have a reminder that God is working. Through the book of Ruth, you never really have a clear picture of what it is God is doing. We, by faith, believe God was working out the details. But we aren't ever told directly God did this thing. Whereas in 1 Samuel, you have God speaking again, you have God delivering messages, you have God being active among his people. Well, the book begins with a beautiful picture of desperation. Elkanah is a faithful man, and he has two wives. His first wife is named Hannah. We typically anglicize that and say Hannah, but Hannah and his second wife, Peninnah. Peninnah is petty, and she's kind of again, a reminder of the way things used to be. But Hannah is really a beautiful picture of faithfulness. And Elkanah shows love to Hannah, even though she is barren. She's not able to have children for him. He still treats her with kindness. He still offers her a great, gives her a double portion of food. He tries to show favor toward her and to show her that she is still loved. And that's a great picture considering some of the things we've already seen in the past few chapters of the Bible. Hannah is also a picture of faithfulness. She loves and worships and trusts in God. And you see that there in chapter 1. She's desperate to have a child, and so she turns to God for help. She doesn't turn to concubines. She doesn't turn to any other method. She turns to God, and she trusts that God will work this out for her. And Eli is a picture of faithfulness. As he's in the temple working, and you see in verse 17, he gives a blessing from God, trusting that God will do the very thing that he says God's going to do. And so Hannah has gone to the tabernacle in Shiloh. She is turning to God for help, asking him to provide her a child. And she makes the promise, Lord of armies, if you'll take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut. It's interesting to me here, the connection between Samuel and Samson, that Hannah decides that she will make the Nazirite vow for her son. That's different than Samson, where an angel comes down and says, he will be a Nazirite all the days of his life. The God chose Samson to be a Nazirite, whereas Hannah, she chooses Samuel to be a Nazirite. She is declaring that he would belong to the Lord. And it's just, a new picture of one of God's people making the right choice instead of God having to force the right choice. Well, of course, Hannah is a picture of righteousness along with faithfulness because she makes this vow to the Lord in verse 11. Eli makes this pronouncement that God will grant her request. And you see in verse 18, she went on her way, she ate and no longer looked despondent because she trusts in God's announcement. The next morning, she comes back to the tabernacle to worship the Lord again before she heads home with her family. In verse 20, when she has the child, she names him Samuel because she says, I have requested him from the Lord. That's a reminder of her vow. His name itself reminds her of the vow she made before God. And we see in verse 21 and 22, she plans to keep her vow. She plans to follow through with what she has promised to the Lord. She dedicates them to the Lord's service. Verse 24 through 28, she is making sure that when she weans him, she goes and offers a sacrifice to the Lord, and she gives the child to Eli. And then her song that you find over in chapter 2, verses 1 down through verse 10, is a beautiful song of the faithfulness of God. And what you have there is you can compare this song to the songs of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. It's interesting that all three of them became pregnant in miraculous ways. All three of them dedicated their sons to God's service. Their songs were all offered in response to God's faithfulness to give these sons to them. And then of more significance, it's interesting that in all three of their songs, there is this theme of God reversing the fortune of the downtrodden, the lowly, and turning their fortune to being a good thing, that the lowly would become powerful, that the forsaken would be remembered. And that similarity between these songs is significant because you're going to see a lot of similarities in the life of Samuel and the life of Jesus. In contrast to all of that, unfortunately, we have Eli's family. Eli's family is not like Elkanah's. His sons are supposed to be dedicated to the Lord, but they're not. They're very unrighteous. They do ungodly things. And you see that very specifically in the latter half of 1 Samuel chapter 2. If it's not clear enough, you've got statements like this. There in verse 21, the positive. The Lord paid attention to Hannah's need, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters, and Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. In contrast, Eli was very old in verse 22. He heard about everything his son was doing. He confronts his son over in verse 23. And of course, they don't listen to their father, and the Lord intends to kill them. Verse 26 is particularly significant because it says, by contrast, the boy Samuel grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people. Eli is rejected by God. His family will not serve the Lord. And instead, God says he's going to raise up a new priest. He's going to raise up one who will serve him, who will do the right thing, who will lead the people toward righteousness. And we know God does that by calling Samuel. Chapter 3 is the story of Samuel's first test. He has grown in his relationship with with Eli. Eli has become like a father figure for Samuel. But God calls Samuel in his sleep. Of course, you know the story. Samuel thinks it's Eli calling him and goes to Eli. And Eli, of course, realizes that that's not, he didn't call him. And so he sends Samuel back to bed. And Samuel hears the voice again, goes back to Eli. And Eli, it says, on the third time, understood that the Lord was calling him. And he said to Samuel, go and lie down. If he calls you, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. Well, God does call Samuel again. And that third time, Samuel does say what Eli told him to say, and God delivers him a very negative, difficult message. A message of Eli's rejection, that Eli's sons will die, and Samuel is, of course, tasked with the job of what to do with that message. When Eli asked what it is that the Lord had delivered to him the night before, Samuel's faithful. He passes the test because he gives Eli this difficult message, a message that he would not have wanted to give to Eli. And Eli, of course, accepts that message because he is also faithful. Well, verse 19 of chapter 3 says, Samuel grew and the Lord was with him, and he fulfilled everything Samuel prophesied. All Israel from Dan and Beersheba knew that Samuel was a confirmed prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear in Shiloh because there he revealed himself to Samuel by his word. Well, that verse is in direct contrast to the early verses in chapter 3, where it says in verse 1, in those days the word of the Lord was rare and prophetic visions were not widespread. You have a turnaround here where God has been absent from his people to God appearing before his people again, because now he has a faithful servant in Samuel, that Samuel is going to do what it is that God calls him to do. And that is a good piece of news for this people who have been without their God for so long. Go ahead and read 1 Samuel chapters 4 through 6. We will cover that later this week as we continue in the story of the kings of Israel.